Okay, now it's not just these theological or personal concerns that Descartes has. He also has concerns living in the time of what's considered the scientific revolution of basically the 16th and 17th and into the 18th century. And so Descartes is not just um, Catholic, and he's not just a philosopher. By trade, he's also a mathematician and a scientist himself. In fact, he's something of a brilliant mathematician. He's responsible, by the way, for the XY coordinate system, which you probably learned at some point in high school or before. And so, as a scientist, seeing what has become possible in the past 100 or 150 years with people like Copernicus, Galileo, Johannes Kepler, Tycho Brahe, and others. Seeing what's been made possible in virtue of trying to use our own reasoning, our own senses, in order to come up with what seem to be natural laws of the universe or of the cosmos itself, without having to resort to any particular kind of theological explanation, also has Descartes pulling in the direction of thinking that one could understand the world apart from that theological framework in a way that perhaps hasn't been possible in a very long time, if forever. And so, in particular, we might think of Copernicus's idea that we live in a heliocentric galaxy or universe, overturning what had been the authorial opinion or belief at the time, surely held by the Catholic Church, that we are in a geocentric universe. In other words, moving from a geocentric, Earth-centered framework to a heliocentric framework in which we think it's actually us, the Earth, here on Earth, revolving around the sun. And in a way that challenges the kind of authority of the framework of thinking at the given time. Because what it does is it displaces where it is that we think of ourselves as being located within the universe, not at the center any longer, as being, say, at the center of God's concerns, as being obviously made within the image or the likeness of God, to being displaced onto just another planet, just another Earth, which happens to orbit the sun. And by the time we get to Kepler and by the time we get to Galileo and Kepler, doesn't even orbit the sun in what seems to be a circular orbit, but in fact is elliptical, thereby challenging the very idea that we're at the center of what seems to be a perfectly centered whole. An idea that had been passed down through the generations of the Middle Ages and stemming from someone that we'll see soon enough in Aristotle. And so we might think that there are personal motivations for Descartes, wondering what it is that he actually knows versus what he can't claim to actually know for certain. We can think that there are theological or religious motivations for taking up these meditations, but also, and equally important, are these kind of scientific concerns. And so when he is looking for a foundation, he's looking for a foundation for all of these, for knowing how it is that he fits in this universe in both a religious or theological manner and also in a scientific sense. And I think in that way, at least some of his concerns might not be so far from our own, about trying to understand how it is that we fit in this universe, and what it is that we can know for certain. And so I want to, by looking at Meditation 1, if those are some of the motivations for Descartes to look for certainty, I just want to hit upon a few important moments and arguments and there are basically three, with a few things in between. The first, that he gives an argument concerning the senses or sense perception, all the senses, The second is an argument about dreams. And the third is this strange thing, you can call it the evil demon idea. I'll also call it the evil demon scenario or the evil demon thought experiment. So let's just run through each of these so that you have a sense of the structure of this meditation. Descartes says, if I'm going to look to try to figure out which of my beliefs might be true versus false and how to tell the difference between them, there's no way I can possibly go through all my beliefs. If you think this about yourself, how could you possibly go through all of your beliefs? How many millions of beliefs do each of us have? Maybe an infinite number. And so given that, there has to be a more manageable way of turning to my beliefs and evaluating them and assessing them. And so Descartes says, well, I can group them in certain ways. And one way that I can group them is to think about how it is that I achieve these beliefs, or how it is that some of these beliefs result in me. And one common way, I think that many of us would think this, is that I get a lot of my beliefs about the world through my senses, or through sense perception. I see things, and therefore I believe something about them, or I hear them, or I taste them, smell them, or I feel them. But then Descartes says this, and this is what's really crucial. It seems as though what I believe in virtue of my senses is sometimes illusory. It seems as though my senses can deceive me. And I'm sure that you can think of examples in your own life in which your senses have deceived you in one way or another. If you think about common illusions, think about going down to the water, a stream or a lake or what have you, and you place a stick that you find in the water, and it appears bent to you. Of course, we know it's not, but it appears as though you see it as being bent. And yet this seems to be a case in which our senses are just deceiving us. Think of someone who sees a mirage, like an oasis in the desert. Well, that seems to be another kind of sensory illusion. And there are all kinds that we could come up with for all of our senses. Or if you think, for example, of here's one for hearing. If you think of one, this children's game, if you ever played it as a child, sometimes it's called telephone, sometimes it's called whisper down the alley. There are different names for it. It's the idea, and I think you know, where you start off at one end of the room and one child whispers a message to the person next to him or her, and it makes this message makes its way all the way around the room, it snakes around the room, until we get to the last child. And we ask them, well, what message did you hear? And here's the thing, even when children are being honest about this little game, most of the time they're not, but even when they're being honest, inevitably the message that the last child hears is always different than how that message began. And so here again, it seems as though our senses can deceive us in all kinds of ways. We can think of illusions, we can think of hallucinations that people undergo, and there are other examples, but here's his point. He says it seems as though if my senses have deceived me even once, just once, they're no longer reliable or trustworthy for telling me what is true and what is false. And if they're no longer reliable or trustworthy in that sense, then I have to be able, based on this method, I have to throw out all my senses as possibly providing me certain knowledge, if they've deceived me even once. Another way of putting that thought is this. I surely can't tell when it is that my senses are deceiving me versus when they're not deceiving me. And so if I can't tell the difference between when they're deceiving me or when they're not deceiving me, because there are definitely instances in which I don't think they're deceiving me, but they are, well then, I can't rely upon them. And so any and all information provided, any and all beliefs provided by the senses, is no longer a candidate for certain knowledge. That's the first kind of idea. Here's the second, and it's just an extension of that first idea. If I can't tell when it's the case that my senses are giving me actual knowledge versus not, then if I take that even further, it seems as though I couldn't even possibly tell whether I'm in a dream right now. It can seem to me as though I'm here sitting by the fire, he says. But maybe I'm just really dreaming that I'm sitting by the fire. Maybe none of this is actually real or really happening at the moment. And so in the same way I can't tell between illusions or veracious information, I can't tell whether I'm dreaming or whether this is actually reality. And now, I suspect that some of you are thinking it's almost too common of a thought today. I'm sure some of you, many of you perhaps, have seen movies like Inception by Christopher Nolan, or movies like The Truman Show, or like The Matrix. And there are more, but here are three kind of blockbuster Hollywood movies, which are based on this kind of idea, which stems from 1641. This is basically the premise for those kinds of films. And so, if the dream argument is just an extension of the senses argument, I just want to make a quick suggestion to you. If you've seen some of these films, I want to suggest real fast that Inception is probably most analogous to this dream stage, whereas The Truman Show and The Matrix are probably closer to this evil demon scenario. And so what is this evil demon scenario? First, I want to say that there's something in here between talking about dreams and talking about the evil demon scenario. There's one more step that we should talk about. So, Descartes thinks the following. Maybe it's the case that I've been looking in the wrong places for what certain knowledge might be. Everything that I sense, or it seems that I sense, or everything that I come by in my dreams, seems as though, has a particular kind of property. It seems as though everything I come across through my senses is extended in some fashion. And he's going to make this distinction very important. Here's one way of characterizing it. Sometimes he says, well, there are a couple of kinds of objects. Some objects are composite, and some objects are simple. And all he means by that is that composite objects are composed of two or more parts. Simple objects are just one part. It's hardly a part, it's just a thing unto itself. And so what he says is that it seems as though, if I step back, what the sciences, what the natural sciences, part of his concern, study, are composite objects, are things which are extended in the world. But if I am going to find something which is certain, it doesn't seem as though I should look toward composite objects. I should look toward simple objects. And there's a pretty good reason for that. If I'm going to find something which is certain, I wouldn't look toward composite objects, because if I did, I would have to be certain about one part, and I would have to be certain about another part. And I would have to be certain about how those parts relate to each other. I would have to be certain about three things instead of just one. And so, in turning from composite objects to simple objects, he says to himself, I'll put aside what I think about the sciences. In fact, I've put that aside pretty much already with the senses anyway. And I'll maybe turn to something which is more familiar to me, something like mathematics. Because it seems as though numbers are closer to an idea of what a simple object would have to be. And so maybe it's the case that by turning to simple objects, I can look toward an idea like 2 plus 3 equals 5. Especially for a mathematician, that seems like a really good candidate for something which might be indubitable or absolutely 100% sure. And yet even that is not completely certain, even on this mathematician's view. And so I'm going to stop the video, and then I'll pick that up in just one moment.